everybody, welcome back. This week I'm going to be working really explicitly and specifically with the development of themes, looking at the ways in which a theme is carried through either of our texts and what we as readers are positioned to do with the end result so that we can look at what message it was that Shakespeare wanted us to take from that. If you're sort of using your photocopied script the way that we've encouraged you to, and if you're using a whole lot of different post-it notes and a whole lot of different highlighters, you are probably starting to develop a living document that is really reflecting your knowledge. So I have, 3 or 4 different colors just on that single page of my script. Each of those colors is then annotated with a note about its relevance. And that's demonstrating that I can see connections between themes developing across my entire text, and that I can see that some themes are more relevant in certain acts and scenes than other themes are. And I'm developing my confidence in being able to talk about those themes in a range of different ways, so that even if I don't see a question that I was hoping to see, or if I don't see the words that I was hoping to see, that I'm flexible enough in my writing that I can devise an argument using what I know and framing it or manipulating it so that I can answer the question that's asked of me in a way that I'm happy with. Okay, so we're going to look at themes today, and the majority of our tutorials this week will be unpacking different themes. Okay, so this one serves as a little introduction to thematic analysis, but then we'll focus on the theme of insecurity in Macbeth. And across the course of the week, I'm going to unpack a range of themes, both for Macbeth and for King Lear. So, as is always the way, let me know in the comments how you're going with your analysis of your text. Let me know if there's a particular theme that you would like to see unpacked in more detail or maybe prioritized this week. And if you have any questions that I can answer. Okay, so on to the tutorial. So we're going to start off by sharing, as we always do, our living PowerPoint document that has all of our information that we need and that we've developed as part of the package for getting ready for the external assessment, which you will find on your Padlet and which is available to both English and literature students as they need it. Okay, so here is something that I think it's really important to emphasize right from the outset. When we think about themes in texts, we don't see them in the same way that we would see a character, or the way that we would see a symbol, or the way we see motifs. Sometimes when we think about characters, it's kind of like playing with dolls, and we know that we could act out the story. We can't really act out the story for a theme in quite the same way. And in fact, themes often defy definition because we don't have those clear parameters to define them and to see them in texts. So the key thing to take at this point is that themes are big ideas, big concepts, and that they are not present in a text by themselves. They actually require a range of vehicles to develop them and carry them across a text. Okay, so a vehicle is just a fancy way of saying that a theme kind of has to piggyback onto something else in a text in order to convey its message. So when we think about the vehicles of thematic analysis, these aren't trick questions. What we're talking about is things like characterization. So if I'm looking at the message that the reader is supposed to take about the relevance of insecurity in Macbeth, then what better way to do that than to look at the character of Macbeth? Now, if Macbeth was the only character in the story, then we would look at him in isolation. But of course, he's not the only character in the story. And the best way to understand what he does and who he is not to look at him in isolation, but to look at him in relationship to other characters and in contrast to other characters. So when we think about characterization, we're moving away from that idea that characters are like our Barbie dolls and they exist separate from the author. And we're thinking about characters instead as deliberate constructions that reflect the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the author and are put together in such a way to position an audience to accept that perspective. So when we look at characters in conflict, so when we look at Macbeth and Macduff in conflict, or Duncan and Macbeth in conflict, then what we're trying to see is by examining their outcomes, by examining what ultimately leads to the end of their story, we're looking at what we as audience members should take from that character in terms of that theme. So if I was to look at something like insecurity, the fact that Macbeth ultimately is beheaded, so he reaches a very secure end, very finite end in his story, but that end is his death and his perception as a monster and a tyrant. We know that we are positioned to see acting on the insecurity or taking steps to shore up our insecurity as ultimately fruitless, particularly if they're selfishly motivated. Okay. So something else we can look at as a vehicle for thematic analysis or thematic development is the plot. So of course it makes sense that the key events tell us something that we're supposed to understand about a big idea. So if an event only happens because of a theme, so if a plot point like a murder only happens because of a character's insecurity, then it's relevant to talk about the theme when we talk about that plot point, or conversely, to talk about the plot point when we're trying to analyze the theme. It's also important to look at who's involved there, who isn't even on stage, who is noticeable in their absence, because all of those details are part of a careful construction. And you as an audience member should be able to and are encouraged to take note of who's missing, who's present, who says a lot, who says nothing, to form your opinion. Motifs are another great technique to carry a theme through a whole text. Now, motifs, remember, are the recurrence of little ideas. So sort of like Easter eggs in a movie. And the frequency with which these motifs appear and the relevance of who uses, and the details of who uses them and the significance of that motif to the scene can be used for for thematic analysis. So if we were to look at the presence of darkness, for example, in as part of the analysis of the theme of insecurity, we can see that for the first two murders, Macbeth is very careful to invoke darkness, I should say, invoke darkness to cover his actions, because while he has committed to taking these actions, he's aware that his security as king is tied to the perception that he is a good king. And if people knew that he was in fact guilty of treason and he had murdered the king originally, then he certainly isn't going to be viewed as a good king. Very similar to motifs are symbols. Now, the big difference between motifs and symbols is that symbols are still those recurring ideas, but they have extra power attached to them, power beyond their literal meaning. For us, this could be something like the appearance of blood, where the word blood is not just the essence of life within our veins. It is the essence of a family's lineage. So the idea that what connects fathers to sons and mothers to daughters, etc. And of course, in royal families, what connects legitimacy of one king to the next. So that's one meaning of blood. So there's two meanings straight away. So the lifeblood of the person and the blood of a family, but also the association of spilled blood with violence. So, when we first meet Macbeth, he's on a battlefield, he's cleft someone in twain, and one would assume that the association with blood is quite common for him because of his job as a warrior. The murder of Duncan then, that sprays blood everywhere, that marks his hands, where he is saturated in it, can be seen as similarly violent. So there's that association of blood and violence, blood and death, as a way of connecting, giving symbolic power to the word. And the last one would be the idea of a prologue or an epilogue. Now, our play doesn't have a prologue or an epilogue. That is a little standalone speech where someone explains the message we should take from it. You would have seen a prologue and an epilogue in Romeo and Juliet. You may have heard that there's something like an epilogue in Midsummer Night's Dream. But the whole point of a prologue or an epilogue is to give essentially an exposition, so a straight address to the audience, explaining what's happening and positioning them to go from the audience or go from the theatre and live their life differently, see something, do something. So we don't have an epilogue and a prologue, but what we do have is a couple of characters who do much the same job. So in Macbeth, we have the character of the porter, who is supposed to be very like an everyday character insofar as he goes about doing his job, perhaps with the influence of a hangover, impeding his better judgment. And we have a character like the fool in King Lear, who actually serves no other purpose than to offer criticism of Lear's behaviour to him and to the audience. So he doesn't actually develop the story. He disappears actually after Act 3. So he's not central to the plot point, but he is really useful to the audience when what actually starts happening on stage becomes quite confusing and difficult to follow. Okay, so having thought about some of the vehicles of thematic analysis, we're going to start looking at a theme. Now, here is a really important point that I want you to understand. I am not going to highlight every quote that you could use to show how Macbeth conveys the theme of insecurity. One, because that would take a really long time, and virtually any line could be used if we wanted to and be manipulated to explain a theme of insecurity. Why I'm not doing it primarily, though, is that when you're working in an unseen exam where you can't take a script in to support you, you must be able to work with the idea behind key quotes, or if you've learned key quotes, be able to explain to your reader exactly why those words position the audience to view the theme of insecurity in a particular way. So if it's about the concept, if it's about the idea of the scene, then paraphrase. If you're going to use a direct quote, then you're using a direct quote because those words mean something. All right. Regardless of whether you paraphrase or use direct quotes, though, I'm not going to tell you every single thing to underline, because your understanding of the play comes from what you underline. It comes from what notes you write down. And the more that you do engage with your script, the more notes you take, the more questions you ask, the more confident you're going to be to answer just about any question that there is. All right. So what I'm going to do in these little tutorials then is highlight a theme and show you ways that you could unpack it using a range of different stylistic devices. So it'll be the same kind of structure to all of the tutorials, but with a different thematic focus each time. And because different literary devices, for example, are used to convey different themes, that'll be an opportunity to explore some different literary devices as we go through. Alrighty. And we're just going to change slides. There we go. Okay, so the first of the devices that we can use to, first of the vehicles that we can use to explore the theme of insecurity is characterization. The points I've made there is that there are like a number of different characters, and each of those could be used to explore the idea of insecurity in different ways. Little point here to think about. If the word insecurity is one that you haven't really thought about, you haven't been using in class, you would find hard to use in an exam, what are some synonyms that you could use instead? So maybe is there uncertainty that you could explore? So rather than insecurity, the idea of uncertainty. Look at the opposites instead. Sureness, finality, definition. So those are words that would suggest that Macbeth knows exactly what to do and how to do it. So if we're saying to what extent is Macbeth's role defined by insecurity, then we're thinking about the ways in which he cannot find sureness, the ways in which he cannot find definition. And we're looking at how those might actually impact on his rule. So there are a number of different characters we could use to explore insecurity. The first of those, of course, is Macbeth. So Macbeth is shaped by his hamasha, which is a sort of a multifaceted or a dual-faceted hamasha. He is ambitious, but he wants the success without the obstacles or the uncertainties that come along the way. And if for any of us who have taken steps to achieve a goal, we know that there are those points of what if. Well, what if I fail? What if I don't make the team? And ultimately, we make decisions to also shore up our success. But normally our decisions are, I'll go and practice more. I'll ask my teacher questions, not I'll kill the king. So through the characterization of Macbeth, we see a character who wants the confirmation of his success before he takes action. All right. And we, as audience members, are positioned to see how central the idea of insecurity is to being just human, because we've all asked, what if? And we've all asked of ourselves, so if that's the option, then what could I do next? Or if I've been promised this, then I'll have to take actions to achieve it. So if Macbeth is central to the characterization of insecurity, then I should be able to find quotes, not necessarily quotes that I would use the whole quote of in an exam, but quotes that I know I could go and underline in my script and write a little note to myself. So you can see that I've focused between Act 1 and Act 3 here, just to find some different types of quotes that would help me to identify that Macbeth actually expresses something that is fairly central to the human condition. So the first one is from Act 1, Scene 3. And this is immediately after he's been given the prophecies, Hail, Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and King Hereafter. So he is internalizing what he's heard at the same time that Banquo is kind of beside him, getting his head around hearing that he will not be a king, but he's going to be the father to a line of kings. Okay, so, Macbeth is trying to process this. He's really ambitious. He wants success. He likes to be rewarded for his actions. So while he might be brave and noble and courageous Macbeth, he also likes to be noteworthy Macbeth. He wants to be well-respected Macbeth. And that comes through the titles that he's given. So he says, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success commencing in a truth? So it can't be all bad if I've been told the truth to start. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? So if it's bad, why would you start off by telling me something good and true? And if it's good and true, then why would you essentially present it in such a way that the only way I can achieve it is the horrid image of me killing the king to get it there, which is such a horrid image, it doth unfix my hair. So my hair goes boing, and my heart knocks at my ribs because it's so unnatural. It's so against the laws of nature to want to kill the king. Okay, so you can see we've got that idea of him wanting surety and having to weigh up what he could do because surety isn't there. Okay, so there's the first quote, straight after the prophecies. So then we have one from Act 1, Scene 7, which is another significant scene because we are trying to commit to the murder of the king. We have been manipulated by Lady Macbeth already. We are engaging in the process of setting up the evening celebration where we can, manipulate the guards so that they are drunk and therefore unable to attest to their own guilt or innocence. And in a moment of quiet reflection, he says, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. only vaulting ambition which overleaps itself and falls on the other. So for me, and I've said this to my class, in that particular quote, there's a few interesting ideas. The first one is that idea of have no spur to prick the size of my intent. So I don't have the will or the desire or the motivation to do what I have to do. I don't want to do it. Like, it's a pretty bad thing. I don't want to do it. But I do have an excess of vaulting ambition. So I want the trappings of success. So I don't really want to murder anyone, but I'd really like to be the king. If it was possible to be the king without murdering someone, that would be really good. So the first one is that I don't. So the bit of the quote that it is at the heart of supporting the characterization of insecurity is, I have no spur to prick the side of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. Okay, so don't want to do it, but I would like the success and the recognition that comes with doing it. But for me, what I find really interesting is the use of the word overleaps, because this word appears twice. And what is actually encompassed in the use of this word, and specifically the fact that it's used twice, is the idea that when we overleap something, when we overstep, when we overbalance, we actually go too far. So he's recognizing something of his own hamasha. He's recognizing that his ambition is so great and so likely to bring him undone that he actually feels that it will overleap where it should land and fall on something worse. So it's really interesting, just the use of that word on more than one occasion in the play, as Macbeth recognizing the limitations of his own character traits within the story as a whole. Okay, so clearly there's a lot more that we could say about Macbeth. He's central to the characterization of insecurity. But because we never look at characters in isolation, let's think about the juxtaposition of Macbeth against other characters. So the characterization of Banquo lets audiences see a character, positions an audience to see that insecurity comes from promises, but they don't have to motivate a character. So Banquo hears the same prophecies, and he chooses, instead of finding a way to be insecure or to be unsure about what could happen with his life, he just continues as is. He operates from the assumption that regardless of what the weird women, if they are indeed weird women, the women with the power of prophecy, like the Fates were, that if they've foreseen this, then the path I'm on is going to get me there. So I don't really have to do anything. I'm not going to have to kill a king to become the father of kings. That's just going to happen eventually. Okay. And so when we juxtapose Banquo and Macbeth against each other, we get that idea of what it looks like when you let the unsureness of prophecy manipulate you, against what we see when the unsureness of prophecy has no effect on you at all. So that's an interesting thing to see. All right, next one. Through the characterization of Macduff, again, in juxtaposition with Macbeth, we see what happens when a character is motivated simply by resolve and conviction. So this is not a character who's been made insecure by prophecy. This is a character who could have been made insecure by the death of his family. But what we see instead is a character who is wholly motivated by resolve and conviction. In the scene between Ross and Lady Macduff, Lady Macduff is quite critical of him, saying that he's fled England essentially because he's a coward. And Ross urges her to perhaps consider that, in fact, he's been motivated by wisdom, that it was prudent for him to get out of Scotland when he did. Now, regardless of whether it was wise, it certainly was. It certainly was an act of resolve. He chose not to go to the coronation of Macbeth, and he's seen as absent from that particular function, and he's gone to England. So he has taken actions that will result in him being seen as a traitor by Macbeth. He can't undo that now. Because of his conviction, there are consequences for his action. Now, ultimately, he is successful. He is one of the few characters left alive at the end of the play. He is going to be named one of the new Earls of Scotland, one assumes, and he will be the right hand to Malcolm, who is taking the throne. But the message that we also get is that conviction, which we would generally consider a really worthy trait to have, will not always result in good consequences. Macduff is required to live with the fact that the conviction that he felt to ride to England and find Malcolm resulted in the death of his children. Okay, so at least in part. So that's one thing to take there. So we had the characterization of insecurity as being central to the human condition. When we are presented with what ifs, we want to think about what actions could happen, what actions could be taken, and what they might mean for us. A character like Banquo is a character who's presented with the what ifs and says, so what? So what if? So what? When we see a character like Macduff, what if is irrelevant. We are goal-oriented, we see our outcome, and we head towards it. And finally, Lady Macbeth is such a wonderful character because she is sometimes like the little devil that sits on our shoulders. So the character, she characterizes the idea of manipulation. And the reality is that manipulation is made much easier by a character when that manipulation is of a character who is insecure. So what we see in Lady Macbeth is intelligence, or at least knowledge of her husband, and the ability to play with what it is that he most values, play with what he's been told, and play with his weaknesses to get an outcome that is in her best interest as well as his. Okay, so the quotes that I've looked for in Lady Macbeth, I mean, there were quotes for the other characters as well, but the quotes that I looked for Lady Macbeth were the ones that highlighted something that she saw as a failing in Macbeth and how she could then manipulate that to achieve an outcome. So that's what we're looking for. Something that is a weakness in Macbeth tied to his lack of sureness that she can then manipulate. So from Act 1, Scene 5, when she gets a letter, yet I do fear thy nature, it is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. So that is both a reference, of course, to the humours, the liquids, the substances that make up the human condition, and the colour of milk and the substance of milk is always associated with gentleness and kindness. Now, when it's milk, it tends to be quite positive in connotations because it's synonymous with mother's milk. When we hear references to things like lily-livered or whey-faced, so it's that same pale colour, but the connotations are entirely negative. So the references to white tend to be associated with cowardice. So essentially she's saying, look, he's a little bit too weak to take the most direct route to get what he wants. Yeah, there's a short-sightedness here. She may be prepared to take the most direct route, but she's not necessarily equipped to deal with what happens after, but we'll get to that in a second. Then from later in the same scene, right at the end of Act 1, Scene 5, you shall put this knight's great business into my dispatch, which gives solely sovereign sway and masterdom. So you're going to give the management of the knight to me, right? So that is a really quite explicit manipulation of Macbeth's authority. Hand over the planning of tonight to me, I'll make it happen, okay? And what's going to happen as a result is that it'll give sovereign sway and masterdom, okay? So we're going to get what we want, but you're going to let me do it. Then, of course, a true example of manipulation. So the language of playing with ego, of playing with personality, of playing with emotion. What cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan? So even what cannot you and I, so uniting, upon the unguarded Duncan. So the language there is, it highlights a power imbalance. It invites Macbeth to be united with her, and it's bravado. Like, what can't we do? No one's going to tell us otherwise. No one's going to think that we did anything wrong. And then, of course, because manipulation will eventually have an outcome, we have this from Act 3, Scene 2. So remember, by Act 3, Scene 2, we have killed Duncan. Banquo's death is imminent, but Lady Macbeth has not been involved in the planning for Banquo's death. And so between Act 1 and Act sorry, Act 2 and Act 3, one has to assume the relationship between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth has become far colder, far less interdependent. Okay, and so Lady Macbeth is feeling the impact of the decision she's made. So she says, "Naught's had, all spent, where our desires got without content. 'Tis safer to be that which we destroy, that than by that destruction dwell." That should be a than by that destruction dwell in doubtful joy. Okay, so we don't have anything, but we've paid everything. And that happens when we get what we want, but we can't enjoy it. We're not content with it. So that's suggesting that there's a feeling of unease already in Lady Macbeth. "'Tis safer to be that which we destroy than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy." So it'd be better to be dead than to be unsure about what it's like to be, to be unsure about what's going to happen next. And that idea is something that the witches pick up in their second presentation on the stage, which is when we see the witches with Hecate, and they talk about that insecurity is man's greatest fear, that without security we can't act, we can't get anywhere. All right, so we could look at insecurity through characters. They're the most obvious vehicles, and there's so many of them. Why wouldn't you use them? But in addition to the characters whose continued presence gives us lots of information to explore around themes, we could also use symbols and motifs. So this little slide is just looking at, again, without giving you all the answers, how I could use the witches. Okay, so first thing is the fact that they're witches. So straight away, they're outside society. They don't conform to the rules. They're female, but Macbeth says they've got hairy chins, so we're not really sure if they're male or female or even of this world. So everything about their physical construction leads to uncertainty. But then there's also the fact that they appear and disappear. And that seems unpredictable. So if they are transitory, ephemeral in nature, they can't be entirely trustworthy. Their unpredictability makes us unsure about their motives. Okay, so a Jacobean audience, of course, is going to go, of course you don't trust witches. Of course you don't trust weird women who appear and disappear. But Macbeth, of course, is so desirous of that security and of that sureness that he's prepared to listen to just about anybody. So I could look at the actual appearance and disappearance of the witches as a symbol of security, but I could also look at their prophecies, and prophecies are like horoscopes. They have just enough that when something happens, you can say, yes, that's what it was, but not enough to actually be finite from the start. So hail Glamis, hail Thane of Cawdor, both things that happen. We get that sureness is given to us almost immediately. And King Hereafter. Right, so there is the start of a moment of insecurity, a moment of the lack of definition to what that prophecy is offering. Will I be king hereafter if I kill the king, or will I just be king hereafter because something else is going to happen? Maybe my poor wife is going to die and I'm going to be married off to a queen in another kingdom, and I'm going to be king somewhere else. We don't know that because that's not given to us. And then the second set of prophecies, of course, reiterate this when we see the image of certain things. So the image of the wood, the image of the bloody child, the image of the crowned head, each of which, and then the line of kings with Banquo at the back. So those images are unpacked by the witches for Macbeth, and he assumes the meaning that he wants to assume. The bloody child, if we looked more closely at what that bloody child is, or if we took in the background of that image, if there was such a thing, we would actually have far more surety about, that's a newborn child, not just a bloody child. In the background is his mum. She's had a cesarean. That makes a whole lot more sense, but we don't get that. Okay, so Macbeth makes assumptions, which is another great word to associate with insecurity, assumption. We make assumptions, and from those assumptions, we draw the wrong conclusion, and ultimately that leads to our downfall in the play. So we could look at the symbol of the witches. We could also use the motif of darkness. Now, this is one of my favorite motifs. And I think if you were to do a bit of binge watching of Disney movies or of old, beautifully put together, say, classic movies from the 30s and 40s, you would see how frequently the motif of darkness is used to build and breed insecurity. So we're just never quite sure about things that happen under the cover of darkness. And Macbeth obviously manipulates this deliberately so that other people will be unsure of who it was who killed the king or who it was who killed Banquo. It's interesting, of course, then that by the time the Macduffs are murdered, he doesn't care. It's done in broad daylight. So the murder of the Macduffs is no longer something that he feels he needs to be secretive about, ultimately because someone else physically does it. But he's sure enough in his authority now that no one can touch him, even if they do think he's responsible. But anyway, in Act 1 and Act 2, even Act 3, Macbeth calls frequently on the cover of darkness. He talks about the world being under the veil. He even talks about the ground being so silent, like to suppress his footsteps so that the world neither sees nor hears what he's going to do. So quite frequently there's this reference to darkness. The two times that we hear talk about the subversion of natural order, whether it's the porter talking, whether it's the old man and Lennox, I think it is, in the pub. They're daylight, but the cover of darkness hasn't quite left. So remember the pub scene, it's daylight, it's daytime, I should say, but there's an eclipse, so we're in the darkness. And the porter is hungover when he hears the knocking at the door. So darkness, fogginess of his brain hasn't quite left yet. So think about the way you could manipulate the use of the motif of darkness to make an argument about insecurity. All right. So that's that one. What I would aim for you to do then is to say, okay, so I'm going to find 3 different stylistic devices that are used as vehicles to carry a theme. An obvious one would be characterization. In fact, you could make an argument, you could make an entire essay about insecurity using only characterization. Okay, but if you're trying to push yourself, you're going to look at the use of stylistic devices like motifs and symbols. You could use the specific, you could make reference to the specific use of a literary device like juxtaposition. And in doing so, you're building a different argument each time for how relevant insecurity is, how much it is a reflection of the values of the time, and how much audiences are positioned to change their own view on that particular theme as a result of the story that we've been told. Okay, so the other thematic analysis tutorials will be much shorter than this one because we've set up the style, but I'm going to unpack the theme and then show you some different stylistic devices that you could use to build an argument. But from this one, the rest of them will be much shorter because I'll just get straight into the analysis. So as I said, if you've got any questions, add them to the comments below. If you'd like me to review a particular theme, also let me know that. Otherwise, stay tuned. See you later.